Absolutely. Economists and everyone else should be held accountable for their advice. There's no point in constantly following the advice of a field that's constantly wrong, for example. But I would say that economists are sometimes or often are held accountable for their advice. In the private sector, if you're an economist and your forecasts are consistently wrong, you may lose your job, but at the very least, no one's going to read your stuff because you're constantly wrong, I'd say. If they do, it's because you're thought provoking, but they know that you're wrong. They just want you to kind of stress test, the client's own thoughts. So there's some value there. But generally, if your forecasts are wrong, everybody figures that out pretty quickly. In the public sector, I think if you're an economist and you're wrong and you're providing bad policy advice, I think there are tons of analysts who are crawling all over that, pointing that out. And so if you have gotten things wrong, I think that gets out, particularly in an age of social media and ubiquitous news, and also in an age of fake news, unfortunately. So some people will get a bad rap unnecessarily, but I think that happens often when it's not clear that policy advice has been right or wrong, because these issues are often really thorny. But I don't think economists do have an outsized role, I think, in policy now relative to previously. I don't think it's because they're better at what they do. In fact, I think we have a lot of soul searching to do as economists to figure out how we've gotten the past 15 years in particular so wrong. I think it's positive that we've had that wake up call, but I do think that people will remember, who stood out and said, we're not going to have high inflation or robust inflation for decades. People will remember who stuck their neck out and said, I think we're going to go into a massive financial crisis. Names have certainly been made on those calls. And if you get things wrong, everybody remembers twice as much. So I do think economists are held accountable often. It's a bit tricky because economists often end up being politicians as well in government. And I can think of one example in particular. Every single economics conference I attend ends with someone saying we should really invest more in education. I think every economist can agree that that is generally a good idea.
Yeah.
And yet no one ever does it because the payoff is beyond an electoral cycle. So I do think that when economics and politics coincide, which they often do, then economists can give great advice, and yet it's not politically viable. And that's the planet that we're living on, so you can't do much about it, but it doesn't mean that economists didn't get it. Yeah, I also think now, particularly in this age of Bidenomics, when everybody's trying to figure out what the historical comparison is, and FDR's brought up a lot. And I just think there's an important point to be made about how we remember economic policy having been made, because now everybody sort of thinks, well, FDR had this grand plan. That was his plan all along, and he went and he implemented it and was a hero. And that's not actually how it happened. Often economic policy making involves throwing some spaghetti against a wall, and the spaghetti that sticks, you throw more of that. And so good policies can come out of that sort of approach, and it's often not remembered that actually that's often how policy is made.